come in. Don't be afraid of some change. Don't be afraid of some change. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in.
I'm Karen Dorn-Steele, today's lay leader. I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane. Whether you're in the sanctuary with us today or watching online, it's here that we join together to create a nourishing, liberal, religious home with a mission to champion justice, diversity, and environmental stewardship in the wider world, or as we say more briefly, to create community, find meaning, and work for justice. Our church is a welcoming congregation. We appreciate your unique backgrounds, your beliefs, lifestyles, and differences, all that helps make you who you are. Whether you are a longtime member or whether you're joining us today for the first time, we're delighted to have you with us. Joining us today as guest speaker is Logan Camporeale, a long Italian name. Logan is a public historian with a master's degree in history from Eastern Washington University, and he works for the City County Historic Preservation Office. He'll tell us how he discovered racially restrictive covenants in some Spokane neighborhoods and describe the ongoing battle to remove them from local property deeds. Please join me in welcoming Logan. So now take a few moments to greet one another and try to say hello to someone you haven't met yet. And for those joining us remotely, please reach out by text or FaceTime with your greetings. Please take your seats. We now turn from our informal greetings to formally begin our service by lighting our chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, of our unity and solidarity, of our openness and inclusion, of our community and individuality. May this small flame be our offering of warmth to those who are cold and alone, and a light to those in darkness. May it be a flame that ignites justice in our world and a beacon of hope to those in need. And may it reflect at least a spark of truth wherever trust has been lost and cast a healthy shadow of doubt where it has been found. In 1974, my husband and I bought a mid-century modern house perched on the High Drive bluff. After negotiating the sale, our realtor handed us a deed with an odd paragraph. It said that no persons of color could live in the High Drive house except for domestic servants. I was jolted by this racist clause. 9 years earlier, I joined the Washington, D.C. staff of Congresswoman Edith Green, an Oregon Democrat working with President Lyndon Johnson to pass the 1965 Voting Rights Act. My task was to interview and then prep for congressional hearings a group of black Mississippi sharecroppers whose voting rights were still at risk through physical threats and other intimidation, despite the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act a year earlier. I had naively thought that the landmark civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s would end most discrimination. I was wrong, and the Spokane deed was a stark reminder. The realtor assured me that the restrictive covenant was no longer legal, but it remains to this day on the official Spokane County document, an ugly reminder of our recent past. Today's speaker, public historian Logan Camporeale, has performed a major public service by revealing Spokane's redlining practices. You'll hear about his research and its aftermath today. So how can we redress these wrongs? Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude calls on all of us to begin again, the title of his latest book. Put aside the fairy tale of America as the shining city on the hill and recast the idea of perfecting the Union, not as a guarantee of our goodness, but a declaration of the ongoing work to address injustice in our midst.
All right, our next hymn number is number 318, We Would Be One. Please stand as you're willing and able.
Each time we gather as a congregation, there are always those who are with us in our minds and hearts and whom we want to wrap in our love and care. We light a candle this morning for them. We also honor the people of Ukraine and the families who recently lost loved ones to mass shootings. And after the shocking annulment of women's reproductive rights by the Supreme Court last Friday, we mourn the first loss of a long-established constitutional right in our country's 246-year history. Let us share a moment in silence, embracing others who are here in your hearts this morning. You are welcome to say their names. Those named aloud and those remembered in the silence we hold in our community of compassion. We now gratefully give and receive this morning's offering, which sustains this community and its mission to the larger world.
This morning's story for all ages takes us through many centuries and across the continents. In the middle of the 19th century, a frenzy of support for the Mexican-American War swept across the United States. But a small minority were very unhappy, mostly ministers, scholars, abolitionists, and a few people in the government, such as Abraham Lincoln. A man named Henry David Thoreau also thought the war was wrong. He refused to pay taxes to the American government because of it. However, it was illegal to refuse to pay taxes which are owed to the government. So Thoreau was arrested and thrown in jail. He sat in that jail cell rather than pay the taxes and a fine to get out to make a public statement. I refuse to support the war. Thoreau's friend, the Unitarian minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, came to visit him in that jail cell, and Emerson asked why Thoreau was allowing himself to waste away in jail. Thoreau responded with a challenge to his friend. He said, "The question is not what am I doing in here, but what are you doing out there?" The experience led him to write an essay called Civil Disobedience, which explained why it is necessary to disobey a law when that law is unjust. 60 years later, on the other side of the world, in South Africa, a British-educated lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi got a job. Although allowed to work as a lawyer, Gandhi discovered that he lacked full rights in South Africa, whose laws treated all Indians as second-class people and black Africans, the majority of the population, much, much worse. Gandhi, like Thoreau, was arrested for nonviolent protest against unjust laws. Gandhi read Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, and that inspired him to not give up even when the challenges were so high. Gandhi dedicated his entire life to the principles of nonviolence and civil disobedience. In India, his peaceful leadership encouraged the Indian people to protest until their country won its independence from the British. Near the time of Gandhi's death, in 1948, back in the United States, a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. began his own nonviolent fight. America's government was supposed to protect our citizens' rights and opportunities, but in many places and in many ways, it specifically denied rights and opportunities to African Americans. Laws needed to change, and many people were angry. Some even wanted to seek change through violence. But Dr. King spoke passionately about making change by peaceful means. He joined nonviolent marches and demonstrations to show others how. The more people followed Dr. King's words and his example, the more powerful grew the peaceful demand. Just like Gandhi, Dr. King led peaceful, persistent protest for change. Where did Martin Luther King Jr. find his inspiration? As a Christian, he had learned that the Bible's guidance was to love his enemies. But he learned about civil disobedience from the writings of the transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau, and he believed he could achieve change peacefully because of the ideas in the example of Gandhi. Thoreau, Gandhi, and King, three prophetic leaders in different times, in different places, who found the power of peace. May their words and deeds inspire us in our current times.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I invite you now into a time of meditation. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and reflect on these words from Mohandas Gandhi. The future depends on what we do in the present. It is possible to live in peace.
Good morning, my name is Logan Camporeale, and I'm going to do a little bit of I'm going to try to do two readings, actually, from two different books that are related to my talk later. The first is from The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. When from 2014 to 2016, riots in places like Ferguson, Baltimore, Milwaukee, or Charlotte captured our attention, most of us thought we knew how these segregated neighborhoods, with their crime, violence, anger, and poverty came to be. We said they are de facto segregated, that they result from private practices, not from law or government policy. De facto segregation, we tell ourselves, has various causes. When African Americans moved into a neighborhood like Ferguson, a few racially prejudiced white families decided to leave. And then as the number of black families grew, the neighborhood deteriorated and white flight followed. Real estate agents steered whites away from black neighborhoods and blacks away from white ones. Banks discriminated with redlining, refusing to give mortgages to African Americans or extricating unusually severe terms from them with subprime loans. African Americans have generally gotten the education that would enable them to earn sufficient incomes to live in white suburbs, and as a result, many remain concentrated in urban neighborhoods. Besides, black families prefer to live with one another. All this has some truth, but it remains a small part of the truth, submerged by a far more important one. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments defined where whites and African Americans should live. Today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unattended consequences of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. The policy was so systemic and forceful that its effects endure to the present time. Without our government's purposeful imposition of racial segregation, the other causes, private prejudice, white flight, real estate steering, bank redlining, income differences, self-segregation, they still would have existed, but with far less opportunity for expression. Segregation by intentional government action is not de facto. Rather, it is what courts call de jure, segregation by law and public policy. And I'm going to read a short bit from Karl Maxey of Fighting Life. I'm going to zoom into Spokane. As the mid-1960s arrived, Maxey turned his attention increasingly to Spokane's housing situation. With such a small black population, Spokane scarcely resembled the country's bigger, more segregated cities. Quote, I remember taking my kids to Seattle, and as we came across the Lake Washington Bridge and came in and touched on 23rd and Madison, they were overwhelmed, scared, recalled Maxey with a laugh. My son said, Dad, are there any white people in Seattle? In Spokane, the Maxeys had been accepted, if sometimes grudgingly, in their suburban-like neighborhood on F Street. Their experience had been smooth compared to that of some other black homebuyers of this era. Frank Hopkins, who owned the Ebony Cafe, bought a house on Spokane's north side in 1961 and was almost ready to move in when someone broke out all 28 windows in one night. Hopkins got the message and canceled the purchase. I just had to let it go, he told reporters. The Reverend J.C. Brooks of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church told the Spokesman Review that same year that real estate agents routinely steered black home buyers to the unofficial area for Negroes, a low-income part of town now called East Central, bordered by Division Street on the west, Altamont Street on the east, 9th Avenue on the south, and Sprague Avenue on the north. This kind of redlining, as the practice was known, was especially ironic in Spokane. The city had been settled in its early years with a Western pioneer openness. The funny thing is, the original 300, the city's black pioneers, they lived all over Spokane, said Maxey. The dominant number lived in East Central, but by far, it couldn't be said it was just one area. But introducing new black families into established white neighborhoods, that was a thornier issue altogether. Generally, this de facto segregation was enforced by what longtime black resident Alfonso Hill called, quote, a gentleman's agreement type of thing. Hill said that there were a lot of places the realtors wouldn't take you. As far as the South Hill, forget it. The redlining often went beyond a gentleman's agreement. Sometimes the policy was written in black and white. A 1940s-era Spokane Valley Code of Ethics for real estate agents, adapted from the National Code, read, quote, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood any race or nationality or any persons whose presence will be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. Redlining was not only encouraged, it was considered the ethical thing to do. Meanwhile, deeds for homes routinely included restrictive covenants specifying which races could or could not occupy homes. Historian Quintard Taylor cited a typical 1938 Seattle property deed that said, "The purchaser must be of the white or Caucasian race." And the Chronicle ran a list of 10 Spokane developments in 1968 whose covenants had been declared illegal following the Civil Rights Act of '68. Maxey later said that the Supreme Court rulings in the late 1960s gave us a foothold to blast their legal foundations out from under them.
The river went wild. We sang round the campfire when I was a child. Smoke drifted upward, faces aglow. Memory that stays in my mind long ago. I realized this picture might need a shakedown, 'cause only white people were there on the ground. Whites only zone arise all the time. Bigotry remains an American crime. Well, where we are at is not where we're going. Strong winds of change have been steadily a-growing. The fight for freedom and equality will get what we lack. Justice for all that stays on the track. We have to move forward. We stand at the gate. May justice shut down the engine of hate. Unless we're together, black, brown, and white, Armageddon for sure will be gone in the night. Keep working for justice, keep a cool mind. The country is green again, there's wind in the pine. Come round the campfire, it's summertime. Let there be peace in the valley for all humankind. Let's have peace in the valley for all humankind.
No, you're okay. Okay, I'm going to go try to fix our PowerPoint, and I'll be right back. Sometimes it's good to be a millennial. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a chat about racially restrictive covenants in Spokane, how I learned that we have them, and what can be done to potentially remove them or at least address them. But before I dive into property law and who's allowed to make restrictions about who lives where, I think it's appropriate to just make a land acknowledgement that the land where we're standing right now was long the land of the Spokane tribe, and if they still had control of it, we probably wouldn't have these problems. So I'm going to get started. Like I said, my name is Logan Camporeale, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about this. We'll go through first how I discovered these, and then what we can do about them. When I was in grad school, I went to Eastern Washington University, and I got to work in this really cool building, the Eastern Washington regional branch of the Washington State Archives. And what I did when I worked there is I basically answered phone calls for people who were looking for documents that we had. And so one day I got a call from a lady, and she had just recently moved into a house, and she really wanted to build a new fence at her house. And she had heard from her neighbors that she wasn't allowed to build a new fence because there was a covenant that said she couldn't do that. So she was calling us saying, hey, am I allowed to put this fence in? Can you find this covenant for me? So we went and looked for it. We were able to, she told us her addition that she lived in, and we were able to find the covenant for her. And fortunately for her, there was nothing about a fence. So she was good to go. She could build her fence. But as we were reading through the document, we found something a little bit more insidious. And it was another clause, not about fences, but in this case about race. And it read, no race or nationality other than the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or tenant. I was pretty shocked to read this. I'd never, I had this conception that Spokane wasn't like the South, and it was probably the first time I had read racism in black and white in my own community, and I was definitely confused by it. And my first question was what are these covenants? So in a religious sense, what's a covenant? A promise or an agreement, right? Some sort of agreement. And these kinds of covenants are the same, except unlike a general covenant or agreement or between two people, this is sort of an agreement between a person and the land and any person who may use the land in the future. So these agreements run with the land. It isn't like I make the agreement with you as the buyer, and then when you sell, you get to make a new agreement. These things are bound by the property, a covenant that runs with the land. So what kinds of things are restricted in these covenants? Not just race, there's some other things there. So you'll see this one here restricts against temporary structures or nuisances. This one says no detached garages, because those are bad, you don't want to have one of those in your neighborhood. This one talks about how quickly you must build your home. You need to finish painting and everything within 6 months, so you're not doing this yourself. You probably need to hire somebody. This one sets a minimum size for the ground floor, so they want homes of a certain size. And then, of course, there's this racially charged one that's tucked in as well. So how do these things work? How do you have a covenant attached to your house? This is a statutory warranty deed, so sort of the document that changes hands when you purchase a piece of property, like the one that Karen mentioned seeing earlier when she bought her property. You'll notice on the deed it says the addition or subdivision that this is located in. So in this case, it's High Drive First Edition. It also says it's Lot 6, Block 1. And then you'll see at the bottom of the page it says it's subject to all covenants, codes, and restrictions. It doesn't say what those restrictions are on this document, but as a home buyer, you would want to ask, if you saw this language, what kinds of codes and restrictions are attached with this property? And if you looked in the auditor's records, you would find this declaration of protective covenants. And in the first paragraph there, it says that this is subject to all lots in the High Drive First Edition. So we have our deed, and then here's our covenant that's associated with it, and then you can see that this one also included that racist language. Where in Spokane were these things? I know this map isn't great because it's a little bit hard to see, But they were all over town, some on the north side near Audubon Park, some on the South Hill, some way out in the valley, South Valley, like Chester Hills, U High, some in the north like Otis Orchards. They were all over Spokane, really. Here's two zoom-in areas that you can see. On the left is sort of North Spokane, pretty close to where we're standing right now, around Shadle Park High School and Audubon Park area. And then on the right-hand side, you can see some that are up on the South Hill around Comstock Park. When I did these maps, we'd only discovered about 40 in Spokane, but at this point, we've now discovered 69. So this map will look different once we're done. These covenants are part of a larger process or idea called redlining that happened in the United States through the middle of the century. And redlining itself generally refers to a process or to a product that was produced by the Home Owners Loan Corporation, which was a New Deal agency. And in 1938, they made maps of basically every metropolitan area, and they graded the neighborhoods based on their credit worthiness. They gave them 4 grades: green, blue, yellow, and red. And basically they were telling folks who make loans, banks, you should be willing to loan to the green and blue areas, you should be suspicious about loaning to the yellow areas, and you shouldn't loan in the red areas. And so this had big impacts on people's mobility. When you look at the reasons that they chose these neighborhoods to make them yellow and red, they generally talk about different races living there, different languages being spoken there, different types of businesses being there, and also the zoning of the neighborhood, obviously with a preference for single-family zoning. And so these maps would have made it really hard for somebody who lived in a red neighborhood to even do something like get a HELOC, for example, so that they could make an improvement to their house, because their property a banker shouldn't put good credit worthiness on their ability to come good on their home. These redlining maps inspired but worked in conjunction with racially restrictive covenants. If we look at Spokane's covenant areas and we look at these maps, they line up pretty reasonably, and you can see sort of the overlap between them. You can also see that the mechanisms to ensure segregation in Spokane were super effective. This is a 1960 map. It's actually from '68, but it's showing the 1960 census, and then it's showing Spokane. Each black dot that you see on that map represents 10 black people. And you can see almost all of Spokane's black population, which would have been about 2% of the population at this time, 1.5–2%, live in downtown and in East Central. You can see the two big groupings there. And that also lines up with the neighborhood that I referenced in the reading just a little bit ago. You also see some black dots on the north side, so there was a little bit of mobility for black folks to live on the north side, but you'll notice almost 0 black dots on the South Hill. Basically, there were no black people living on the South Hill at this time. There's also one other group of black dots over here on the far west side, and I think that's associated with some sort of war housing, but I'm not positive. But the long story is, or the short story is, that the mechanisms that Spokanites used to ensure segregation were really effective, at least at keeping black folks in the neighborhood that white folks wanted them to live in. I also had a question about what did it mean to be white. We're talking about, okay, only white folks can live in these neighborhoods. What does that mean? In our language, almost all of the covenants have this exact language. There's very little variation. It's pretty much this language in all of Spokane. But I noticed that in Seattle, there was much more specific language. Like this one says Asiatic, African, or Negro blood. It also talks about like lineage and stuff like that. So in Seattle, there's much more specific terms that are calling out specific groups of people. And I wondered, like, what did it mean in Spokane? You know, ours just says no race other than the white race. And so it was just something that was on me I didn't really have a good answer for. But one day I was at the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture, and I was looking through this oral history collection of Jewish people about Jewish history in Spokane and their experience being Jews here. And this one was from a former congressman's communications guy, Bill First. He was a newsman, maybe you remember him. And he was just talking about his experience being a Jew in Spokane, and I just wanted to read a section of of the oral history. And this is Bill talking first, and he's talking about organizing for a group of Jewish dignitaries who were coming to Spokane to meet with politicians. And he says, of course, the fact that they were even at the round table was because Jews were not allowed in the more classy places in town. Was there a lot of anti-Semitism? Or just exclusiveness? Both. This very area where you live, the Comstock edition, was forbidden for Jews. It was owned by the Coles. In the era before restrictive covenants were outlawed by the Supreme Court, Jews could not purchase a home here. And so it's really interesting, they're actually conducting this interview in a covenant neighborhood that he would not have been allowed to live in just 40 years ago. But at this time I realized, wow, white included, or not white, included Jewish people in Spokane, at least in the 40s and 50s. And so I don't have a perfect definition for you of white today, or what color people were not allowed to live in these neighborhoods, but I can at least tell you that apparently non-white extended to Jewish people in mid-century Spokane. Who's responsible for these things? This might be kind of a law, not meaningful, but for me, I just need to know, who did this? And so, there's a lot of names we don't recognize, like the Gorig family, or Eagle Investment Company, or the Martin family. But then there's some that we do recognize. How about this name? William H. Coles, Jr. Now, maybe you know this one. Here he is. He's now the second, because there's been another William Coles. He's the publisher of the Spokesman Review, and his family has been some of the largest property owners and probably the most powerful family in Spokane for the past 100 years. They put in a number of covenants, at least 5 of them for properties that they developed, and many of the ones that they put in place they did after the Supreme Court had invalidated them. So this is one of Spokane's power brokers, not just one of the largest landowners, but also in control of the city's mouthpiece, and they were a segregationists. At least they were practicing segregation policies. How about this guy? Does anybody know this name? Yeah, some folks know this name. This is Wayne Guthrie. I had never heard his name before I started doing this work, but he was a councilman from the north side. I think he was a 2-time councilman, and he ran for mayor 3 times, in 73, 77, and in 81. And he was also a segregationist. He had put in a number of racially restrictive covenants on his north side developments. But he was also a homophobe and just generally a bad guy. He once said, after learning about a major drag ball in Spokane, he said that Spokane is, quote, not the place for homosexuals. But he did back down on that claim after a public outcry. The only little poetic justice in Guthrie's life is that in 81 he ran for governor again, and he lost to Spokane's only black mayor, Jim Chase. And he lost in a landslide, 75% to 25%. So Guthrie was also potentially a crook and was ultimately pardoned by Nixon for some gross financial dealings he was doing. So, whatever the case, these were Spokane's power brokers, folks who were on council, folks who published the newspaper, folks who were running for mayor, and they were segregationists who were putting in place segregation policies. So how do we get here? Why do we have racially restrictive covenants? And I'm just going to run through these really quickly. But basically, before the Buchanan v. Worley Supreme Court decision in 1917, a city could create a zoning ordinance that said, for example, black people can only live in Ward 1, or black people can only live in Council District 3. In 1917, the Supreme Court said that that's illegal. You can't do that. A city can't have zoning provisions that are race-based. Segregationists quickly started looking for another tool, and they had already been using restrictive covenants for other sort of property things like garages and nuisances and other stuff. And so they were like, let's just tuck our race provision right in here with our restrictive covenants. And by 1926, one of their covenants had made its way to a Supreme Court case. Basically, a black family moved in, and a guy who lived 12 blocks away was suing because it was a violation of the covenant in that neighborhood. And the court said, these covenants are good. This is okay. This isn't a violation of the 14th Amendment. Civil court is not really a state institution, and so you can do that. So after 26, covenants proliferate pretty extensively. The Supreme Court said it's good, go ahead. But by 48, just 22 years later, the Supreme Court changed its mind and went back the other direction, said actually these are a violation of the 14th Amendment. Civil court is an extension of the government and cannot be taking any part in segregating our housing. And so it's amazing that in just 22 years, the court could have such a change of opinion, especially as we're thinking about the court today. Even though the court made that decision in 48, Maxey, and he mentioned that in the reading I was just doing, says that they don't really have anything to stand on. Even though that court decision was made, the Coles were still adding restrictive covenants to their property documents until 53. And so it's really not until 68 with the Fair Housing Act that someone like Maxey with a law degree and someone who'd passed the bar could start suing and actually had some ground to stand on to make change. And so this is when we actually see some housing cases in Spokane coming forward and forcefully desegregating with the law. All right, now let's talk a little bit about removing covenants. That kind of gets us to how we got them and what the situation is in Spokane. So what can we do to remove them? The first thing that I did when I discovered these is I'm a historian, I'm supposed to be objective and just researching, but I'm politically active, and one of my first questions was, how do we remove these? Why are they here? Can they be removed? How come nobody has removed them? And the first thing I did really is I talked to Sean Vestal. I was like, I don't think people even know that these exist, and maybe if we could get a newspaper article, that would be helpful. And so Sean really wanted to write about it. He agreed. He felt like Spokane didn't have a concept that we had this real segregation. And so it was put on the front page of the newspaper, I think in December of 2015. And I was excited about it, but not everybody was excited about it. These are some really grumpy Facebook comments from mad people. I live in Spokane and I say BS. There are blacks and Mexicans scattered all over Spokane. Just crazy comments and even hate mail sent to my blog side. And so people were really mad. But it did something really effective. Even though I had mad people, I also connected with people who are passionate about this. And so I connected with Rick Eichstadt. At the time, he was with the Center for Justice, and then he was at Gonzaga's Environmental and Land Use Law Clinic, and now he's somewhere else. But Rick was really interested in this, and he said, hey, do you know anybody who wants to remove one of these things? Because there is a state law that says we can remove them. We should try. And so I kept giving talks kind of like this and trying to find somebody, and eventually we did find somebody who was interested in trying to remove one of these. So let me just step back a little bit and talk about what the state has done to make it possible to remove these. In 1969, right after the Fair Housing Act passed, the state passed its own basically Fair Housing Act. And they also passed a law, Senate Bill 378, that said that the state needed, that real estate agents could not prejudice on the basis of race. It passed in the legislature, but the Washington Association of Realtors sponsored a referendum, known as Referendum 35, to overturn that law. And could you actually go forward one real quick? We'll bounce back. But this is a map of the law. This basically said real estate agents can't be prejudiced anymore. And the referendum was to say that law was no good, basically. And so you can see Spokane wanted to still be able to have real estates be prejudiced on the basis of race. But the referendum failed, and so the law was upheld on a 53-46 margin. But I just show this to show you how controversial this still was. Half people basically thought that racism in real estate was fine, and half people did not. Could you go back real quick for me? Sorry, thank you. And then in 1987, the state actually created a removal law that said there is some way that a property owner could remove one of these if they really wanted to. And but as far as I know, nobody has ever actually tried to do that until just very recently. And then there's another law here I'll talk a little bit about in a second, but it changed what it means to remove. I know that's silly, but we've been arguing about what it means to remove, and this sort of changed what it means, and it also created some money for us to find all the covenants, and I'll talk about that in a second. yeah, this one, here we go. So we finally found somebody who wanted to try to remove one of these. His name's Alex May. He lived up there in the Comstock edition. We brought it first to the local court and basically asked for a declaratory judgment, just saying like, hey, do the right thing, judge, strike these and remove them like it says in the law. And we thought that that would be pretty easy and straightforward, but unfortunately the county auditor kind of threw her hand up and said, wait, stop, I want to be party to this lawsuit. I can't do what this is asking me to do. I don't have the authority to strike and remove something. As an auditor, it's my job to protect the records. I can't change them. And unfortunately, the court agreed with the auditor and ruled against us and said, sorry, basically just me saying that they're stricken and removed as a judge is sufficient, but we don't actually have to strike and remove anything. Just my order is good enough. We're not going to black anything out, basically. Alex May was interested in appealing, and fortunately Gonzaga decided to take the case to appeal, and so they appealed the case at the Division III Court of Appeals in Spokane. One of your fellow congregants was on the panel, and here's some actual comments from the county auditor and why she thinks that these need to stay. They're offensive, those clauses are absolutely offensive. But the reality is they are history and they need to remain part of the public record. This one's even more weird. She says, you can pull down Confederate statues, but you can't change that the Battle of Bull Run occurred. In this case, this is our Battle of Bull Run. And she goes on basically to justify why these need to remain. In the Court of Appeals, could you click 2 forward? Yeah, we'll skip that. In the Court of Appeals, like I said, one of your fellow congregants was on the panel, and I thought that he really captured why removing these was not amount to erasure, and why it wasn't whitewashing, but was worthwhile. And his dissent was 25 pages, and the concurring opinion, so the prevailing opinion, was only about 7. So you could see a different level of passion from the 2 different groups. But this is the last page of the opinion. I just wanted to read from it because I think it's pretty meaningful. Contrary to the assertion of this court's majority, the loitering of racially restrictive covenants on file with the county auditor does not function as a beneficial historic record of ethnic intolerance in the United States. Eradicating auditor records of offensive covenants will not whitewash the ugly truth of American apartheid. Literature, including this legal dissent, will teach generations of our nation's children about property ownership restrictions that precluded those with darker skin tincture from full enjoyment of American prosperity and encaptured African Americans with an offense of belittling isolation. County auditor records do not serve as books in a library or as historic documents in a museum. County auditor pages function as a town square for real property transactions. The time has come to rip, from the pages of official records, white inscriptions of supremacy. The time has come to tear down monuments to slavery and racial segregation on display in the public square. I think this pretty well captured how I feel about removing racially restrictive covenants. I don't think we need to remove them all at once, but I think allowing them to be removed by property owners doesn't amount to erasure, and I think the judge made that case really well. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court didn't so much agree. It did go to the Supreme Court, and they kind of split the baby and basically said, while that case was pending, the state passed a new law in 2021 that explained what it means to strike and remove, like actually gave steps for how you strike and remove something. And so basically the Supreme Court pointed at the new law and said, hey, you go back and do the new way at the trial court. So I don't know what Alex May is going to do. He may go back to the trial court and try to do it the way the new law says, but I'm just not sure. He's kind of sick of this whole thing at this point. And so that law, the new law, also provided about $200,000 to UW and $200,000 to Eastern Washington University for us to try to find all the restrictive covenants, because we don't even know where they are. There's no list of them. They're hard to find. It takes real challenging historical research to find them. And so we've been working on that. Oh yeah, sorry. What happens next? We're already there. So we've been working on it. Here we are digging into county records in different counties throughout Eastern Washington. We've been all over Eastern Washington so far. All the yellow stars are counties we've been to, like actually in their records and searched in them. The red stars, we still need to go there. And then the blue stars, fortunately, had digital records and have been able to provide those to us. And we're going to use like AI basically to search for the covenants in those places. So far, we've found 111 additions or subdivisions with racially restrictive covenants in the 20 counties of Eastern Washington. Folks often ask me, like, how many properties is that? And I haven't figured that out yet, but I suspect it's between 5,000 and 10,000 properties. And I also suspect we'll find another 50 or so as we continue our research. You might also be wondering, was this a Spokane thing or was it widespread? They're in 9 of the 20 counties that we found them that we've looked in so far. 2 counties we feel confident that they aren't in, and there are still about 5 counties that we haven't even scratched the surface yet. The weirdest one we found, or the 2 weirdest ones we found, is Ritzville Golf and Country Club had a racially restrictive covenant, so pretty rural location. And then just last week we found one on a cemetery in Asotin County, so even black people couldn't be buried with white people as well. And I think that was my last slide. I probably ran over time, but I'd be happy to answer a question or two if somebody had any.
I remember about 30 years ago when Supreme Court Justice Rehnquist, his mother died and he inherited the mother's home. He immediately put it up for sale. Well, when it's sold and the title search was done, a real estate covenant popped up where it stated that members of the Jewish and black race cannot buy this house. So this has been with us for centuries.
Yeah. And part of the reason it's so hard to remove is, like I said, the way that it's the covenant, the way it's basically a covenant with the land more than it is with another person is what makes it so challenging. You can't just pull it out and remove it. Basically, you need 50% of the people in that addition to agree to remove it.
Aren't these covenants attached to the deed?
They are sometimes. Sometimes they're attached to the deed. Like sometimes it's written right on the deed. Like, deed, here are the restrictions. But more commonly, it's either included on the plat map. So like right on the plat map where it shows the streets and the dedication and everything, there'll be a covenant section. Or it's filed separately, generally at the same time as a plat, on a separate document that's associated with the plat.
These racial covenants are not legal, they're not enforceable, so why take the trouble to remove them when they're not enforceable?
Yeah, a lot of people ask that question, right? And so most recently, Land Title Association has been pushing and pushed the legislature to pass the most recent law because it's a financial thing for them. Lots of people try to back out of their sales. They put down their earnest money. They start doing their due diligence with their realtor. They learn that it was a whites-only neighborhood and they don't want to live there anymore. But it's not good cause to back out of the sale. It's not like the foundation is broken. And so they're forced to either move forward with the sale or to forfeit their earnest money. And so the Land Title Association sees this as mucking up business and would like them to be removed because it's mucking up business. I think that it's important for there to be I don't think didactically removing them from all properties makes sense, but I think that every property owner should have the right to freely enjoy their property. And if part of that is being able to remove this relic of racism that's attached to their individual property, I think that there should be some remedy for them to pursue to do that. Again, I don't really support like didactically removing them all from every property. And I also support a black property owner who wants to put his covenant on his wall framed because it's a point of pride for him that he overcame that challenge and now lives in a formerly all-white neighborhood. So that's kind of where I'm at on it. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, Logan?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I thought I read somebody had a solution. You have to keep the wording in the deeds and covenants, but you draw a line through it, say this no longer applies, but it's part of history. We must keep the knowledge alive to avoid it in the future.
That's right. Basically, the new law pretty much says just that. The new law says, basically, make a copy of the original one, take the original one and either put it in like your archive at the county or send it to the state archives where it can be saved, and then draw a line through the old one, refile it, and put a note there that says, the reason this has a line through it is because it was changed pursuant to RCW, blah, blah, blah. You can find the original here. So it draws the line, keeps the history connected so that if somebody wants to understand, they can. But it also prevents someone like Karen from running into that language when she's just trying to do regular business like buy a house. So.
This gentleman makes an excellent
Let's just,
point.
I think we need to move to our close now, but Logan will be here for a few minutes afterwards, so please ask him further questions.
Well, thank you so much, Logan, for bringing your passion and your research about this issue that's right here local to us. It's not somewhere far away. Really appreciate you sharing today. Thank you so much. And I would like to let you know that our next hymn is number 134. Please stand as you are willing and able, for Our World is One World.
As we depart today, I leave you with the words of Abraham X. Kendi. No power lasts forever. There will come a time when racist ideas will no longer obstruct us from seeing the complete and utter abnormality of racial disparities. There will come a time, maybe, just maybe, that time is now. Amen, blessed be, salam alaikum, and shalom.
Shalom Averim, Shalom Averim, Shalom, Shalom, Shalom Averim, Shalom Averim, Shalom, Shalom. I was going to say, if she changed the final one. No, she didn't. Remember yesterday, she was like, I don't think yesterday's the right thing to do.